During the Cold War years, defense as a percentage of U.S. GDP was about 6% on average. It spiked up to 15% or more during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. It then went down to about 3% around 2000. Recently, it's risen to nearly 5%, 4.7%. If you add various off-budget spending and black programs and so on, it's probably well over 5%, 6% of GDP. And yet, despite all of the talk about the fiscal crisis and budgetary problems, discussion of defense and its relation to the rest of the budget has been curiously missing. As we know, President Obama, when he announced a freeze on discretionary spending, specifically exempted defense spending. So the purpose of this panel is to look at defense and its relation to the civilian budget and the overall budget, and to explore various questions. How big should the defense budget be? Apart from the question of overall numbers, what should the composition of spending be? What should the focuses of foreign policy be? Ultimately, the discussion of the defense budget has to be within the context of some sort of vision of American grand strategy going forward after the Iraq and Gulf War. And we'll also be addressing the costs of those wars and of ongoing military operations, of the healthcare costs associated with them. So this is a major contribution, in my opinion, to the discussion about the federal budget in the years and decades ahead. To help us explore these issues, we have a very distinguished panel: Linda Bilmes from Harvard University, Lawrence J. Korb, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, William Hartung, who's the director of the Arms and Security Initiative of the New America Foundation, and Heather Hurlbut, who's the executive director of the National Security Network. You can look at their CVs in greater detail on the conference program materials, but right now I'd like to begin the discussion by asking Linda Bilmes to deliver her remarks. Either way.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for being here today. I think as we sort of shift gears a little bit from thinking about the things that we want to spend money on in society, like taking care of the poor and the elderly and the disabled and ourselves and our libraries and schools, I mean, there's the question of what we're currently spending money on. And where we are spending a great deal of money is on wars and on defense. And so I wanted to kind of start off this conversation by trying to pose the question of whether wars are an efficient way to achieve our strategic defense objectives. And let me start off here by talking about how much money we are spending on the wars. Since 2001, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have cost us more than $1 trillion in cash, which is the sort of very top of the line visible expense. Since 2001, the defense budget has also grown by $1 trillion over and above war appropriations. And we estimate that at least 25% of that amount is related either directly or indirectly to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. For example, some of the direct expenditures include the increase in military medicine in the TRICARE system, which has increased in this period from 19 billion to 50 billion, increase in providing concurrent receipt for veteran pensions, in recruiting costs, as well as indirect costs, such as expanding the size of the armed forces, and indirect overhead costs. For example, in the huge amount of defense acquisition, there are costs involved in developing specifications, bidding, overseeing, monitoring, evaluating, and auditing contracts for the thousands of war-related services that we have acquired. A third, the cost of the wars that I've described are just the very beginning. We know that wars have a long tail, and the cost of wars continues for a very, very long time. For example, disability compensation for veterans. The peak year for paying disability compensation for World War I veterans was in 1969. It's more than 50 years after armistice. The peak year for World War II veterans was in the late 1980s. We are nowhere close to the peak year for paying disability compensation for Vietnam veterans. And even the Gulf War, which lasted for only 6 weeks, costs us now, and we are nowhere near the peak, $4.5 billion per year in disability compensation. Medical care also has a very long and rising tail. And we expect this current war will be much more expensive than previous wars in both disability compensation and medical care. With medical care in particular, we have a much higher survival rate, with 95% of those who are seriously wounded surviving, compared to around 50% in previous wars. A much higher level of non-combat injuries, a much higher incidence of mental health disease, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic stress disorder is incidentally very strongly correlated to combat exposure. We have more than 900,000 veterans who have served 2 or more tours of duty in the current wars. And PTSD is very strongly correlated to a host of medical problems, including heart disease, bronchitis, arthritis, asthma, liver, peripheral arterial disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and other diseases. PTSD sufferers from Vietnam, for example, used other medical care like diagnostic tests and ancillary services, emergency services and hospitalizations, 170% more than those without PTSD. They were 200% more likely to be diagnosed with something else. Now, given that between 30 and 40% of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan are returning with serious mental health problems, half of them with PTSD, we inevitably expect a long and very expensive tail in terms of medical costs. Yesterday, I testified to the House Veterans Committee for, I believe, the 8th time about the long-term cost of providing disability benefits and medical care to Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. We had expected, based on historical patterns, for the cost of treating these veterans over the next 40 years to be between $400 and $700 billion, depending on the length and intensity of the war. We now expect that the cost will be between $500 and $900 billion, and this is mostly to do with the fact that the numbers of those who have been treated and who have filed for disability to date is much higher than we had expected. There have already been more than 500,000 veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan who have applied for disability benefits, and more than 90% of those claims are approved. There have been more than 600,000 veterans from the current wars who have been treated in the VA for medical problems. So when you see the small numbers that are quoted in the newspapers that suggest that there were 45,000 troops who have been wounded in these wars, what you're seeing is a very small subset, a very narrow definition, not looking at the overall cost. These costs do not include many of the other costs, such as subsidized housing, loans, burial benefits, family benefits, vocational benefits, training benefits, and the GI Bill, which we support but which has budgetary costs. When you add those together, we come to at least $1 trillion of veterans' benefits just from the current wars. There are also extensive social economic costs for veterans and their family, including lost output, parents giving up jobs to become caregivers, reservists and guards who come home who were self-employed previously, who lose their jobs, and impaired quality of life. and we are one of the only developed countries that does not provide quality of life lump sum impairment benefits. This quality of life and these social costs also affect hundreds of thousands of contractors who have come home. The government pays in a budgetary sense for this through compensation to insurance companies, but they are also suffering from many of these same medical ailments and so forth, which will go on for decades. This doesn't count the macroeconomic costs, which we have documented in our book, The $3 Trillion War, and which include the impact on the oil price, which was $25 a barrel at the time we invaded Iraq, and rose to $140 a barrel at the peak of the war in 2007. There are also many opportunity costs of these wars, opportunity costs which we have asked, including whether the economic crisis would have been as severe, whether the debt would have been as high, whether we would still be stuck in Afghanistan if we had not diverted attention into Iraq, whether oil prices would have risen to this level. Arguably, the answer to all of these questions is no. The bottom line is that in any analysis of the current wars, you pretty much reach a minimum of $2 or $3 or $4 or $5 or $6 trillion that we've spent. And the question is that whether that is an efficient way, given the resources are constrained, whether that is an efficient expenditure to get rid of a dictator that you don't like, as we did in Iraq. The benefits can be debated, but the costs are not debatable. And many would argue, we would argue, that we are not more secure economically as a result of all of this money being spent on defense. Yet we are essentially pursuing the same strategy in Afghanistan and heading towards similar type of strategies in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, potentially the Philippines, and elsewhere. I have two recommendations regarding this this is obviously a very huge topic, just to start off the conversation here, but I have two recommendations I'd like to offer. First, it may sound mundane, but something that is extremely important is that we need good accounting on what wars actually cost in order to have transparency on what is actually really being spent in defense and national security. Currently, the spending is fragmented across the Departments of Defense, Energy, Veterans, Homeland Security, Department of State, Labor, Housing, and elsewhere. It has taken years for us to painstakingly recreate the costs just in the Defense and the Veterans Department. This spending is also calculated on a cash basis. So we really have no idea what the real costs are. We don't even have overtime. There is not even a government estimate for the long-term cost of providing medical care to military veterans. So we have a situation where we know that the long-term deferred liability for disability compensation is a minimum, according to the U.S. balance sheet, of $1.5 trillion. That's for deferred disability benefits, but there is no estimate for deferred medical benefits for veterans and military retirees. Veterans costs are the fourth largest item in the budget, but it's something which is not very well understood. And all of these costs distributed as they are not consolidated in any kind of national defense accounts. And so it is left to people like myself and Winslow Wheeler and others to try and cobble together what are really very rudimentary kind of estimates as to what our overall costs are. The Defense Department within itself, we know, has a very high level of overhead. We know that the expenditures for military medicine, for TRICARE for Life, which is the military retirees form of Medicare and so forth, are suffering from all of the same problems that the Medicare system are, but it's very difficult to pull those out and to identify exactly what's going on there. Second, we need to change the way we analyze conflicts so that the costs are taken into account and fully estimated at the beginning of a conflict. We need a smarter way to achieve defense objectives so that we are not eroding our economic security in order to achieve objectives related to military security. And I will stop here and invite any questions.
I can take questions at the end.
Oh, at the end, right.
Dr. Court?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Whenever you talk about things you can do in the defense budget, people always prevent all these apocalyptic scenarios that if you do this, things will happen. And together with Bill and Heather, we got together a group to lay down a number of reductions that we asked the Deficit Commission to consider. And as you might expect, we've gotten an awful lot of pushback, calling us an awful lot of names and things like that. And I'm going to outline some of the personnel reductions, and Bill will get into the hardware, and Heather will get into the politics of the whole thing. But I'm reminded of these apocalyptic scenarios, and Bill heard me tell this joke yesterday, so you'll have to another budget group. I'm reminded of the story of this elderly couple who decided that they would go to the Holy Land. And while they were over there, the man passed away. And somebody came to the wife and said, well, you can have him buried here for $50. She said, wow. He said, how much will it cost to bury him back home? They said, about $5,000. She thought for a second, said, I think I'll take him home. And the guy said, this doesn't make any sense. $50, $5,000. She said, well, I heard this story about a fellow who years ago was buried here, and 3 days later he rose from the dead, and I don't want to take a chance. And of course, that's what you can do, no matter what you do. And the next thing to keep in mind is that no matter how much you spend on defense, no matter how much, if you put the whole budget, you would not guarantee perfect security. So what we've done is said, hey, you can do this, and you still will be, very, very, very secure. So I think that's important. Now, I start with the personnel costs. Let me pick up on where Linda was talking about. Whatever you think about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and remember, our elected officials voted for this thing, particularly both of them overwhelmingly. So, when we talk about this, the American people initially supported them. These are the first significant conflicts in our history where we have not raised taxes. Okay? In fact, we cut them. And that, of course, is one of the reasons for the deficit. And the other is we didn't have conscription. So what that did was drive up the cost of military personnel to astronomical levels because everybody was concerned about, nothing was too good, for the troops. And the other thing is, in terms of long-term costs, let me give you something that happened to me. Earlier this year, I was diagnosed with colon cancer. So I was going through the various things, and guys, did you have any history in your family? I said, well, my brother had it, and anybody else? No. And he said, well, what do you and your brother have in common? I said, well, we both went to Vietnam. He goes, when did you leave? 1966. So theoretically, I could still be charging the taxpayers for this. Fortunately, I got a good health care plan. But I think that's important. We will not know. A lot of us won't be here when a lot of these costs that Linda was talking about will have to be paid. Now, in terms of personnel, we do a couple of things. First of all, we say, why do you still have 150,000 troops in Europe and Japan? Interestingly enough, the Europeans are cutting their defense budget to deal with the deficit, and they can basically be free riders. So we say that you can, cut that back and take those troops out of the force. The next thing we say is, and we quote Secretary Gates in Foreign Affairs, and not this most recent issue, the one before, said, we will never do Iraq and Afghanistan again, no more nation building under fire. Well, if that's the case, you can roll back the strength of the Army and the Marine Corps to where they were before you got involved in these conflicts. It's about 100,000 people. The cost of military personnel is close to $150,000 a person. That would save you about $15 billion. And then, of course, the most controversial, in fact, Barney Frank and the people who asked us to do this won't even endorse this, proposal, and that is you got to do something about military pay and health care benefits. Okay, nobody wants to touch it. Again, it's seen as, disloyal, but I think it's important to take a look at it. And the answers are found in the Pentagon. Every 4 years, the Pentagon has what they call a quadrennial review of military compensation. When I was there, we had a report, and they take a look at the pay and benefits. And in 2008, they told Secretary Gates, look, you are using the wrong metric to decide on your pay raise every year. Because what you're doing, and any of you who've been in the military service are familiar with it, base pay is not really the total value of your compensation. Okay, you get free health care, you don't pay for retirement, you got a whole bunch of other things. What you ought to use is what they call, full military compensation. And if you take a look at that, you'll find out military people are way over what the legal standard is, the Employment Cost Index. And they say, this is their thing. You could save $55 billion over the next 10 years just by doing that. Yesterday, or I guess not the day before, Secretary Gates spoke at Duke University. He said, military personnel costs are killing us. They've gone from 90 billion to 170. I said, yeah, they told you what to do, okay, but you don't want to do that. And similarly with military health care, and we're talking about retirees now, we're not talking about people on active duty. You got about 9 million retirees and their dependents who have access to a plan called TRICARE. They have not raised the premiums on that since 1995. When Admiral Allen, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, retired this year, by the way, he gets a pension of $180,000, said, I only have to pay $420 for health care for my family. We should change that, okay? So we're saying for retirees and means tested, okay, and, a CBO, looking at that thing says the Pentagon's task force that Gates set up took a look at that and said, if you do that, you means test it and raise it gradually to about $1,100 a year, which is not bad for a family, you could save another $50 billion. And so those things are going to have to be tackled. People know they're out there. They talk about them. Admiral Mullen says, well, healthcare costs are killing us. Well, the answers are there. The question, do you have the political courage to do it? Will the Pentagon, take the lead and make it easier for the Congress? But right now, nobody seems to want to deal with those. So let me thank you for coming and turn this over to, I guess, Bill is next. Get to the hardware cuts.
Sure, I get to cut the hardware. Well, I was going to use that Willie Sutton analogy, but it's been discredited by an earlier speaker. But it is true that if you're concerned about the size of the budget, you have to look at the Pentagon. This year, it's about $738 billion, not counting Homeland Security, not counting veterans benefits, not counting some other military-related items, which is about the same size as Social Security, except the difference being Social Security has projected needs. There's people that need this, whereas defense is based on kind of a sense of what's needed to defend the country, which is a much squishier concept. Also, if you look at growth in discretionary income since 2001, about 2/3 of it has come from military spending. Nothing else even comes close. About 5% of the growth is from health and human services. Everything else is below that. So if you're looking at growth in discretionary spending, it's really the military budget, which now accounts for more than half of the discretionary budget. So no matter how you look at it, it's a huge budgetary concern, a huge component of the budget. It's also true that the United States is now spending almost as much as the rest of the world combined on its military, which was not the case during the Cold War. So there's some question as to, is that really needed? Where is all that money going? Who are the enemies that would justify that level of spending relative to adversaries? And then finally, if just the Pentagon's own accounting says that we've spent projected about $159 billion for the wars in this current year, about 3 times that much for the regular Pentagon budget. Now, as Linda noted, there's some interaction there, so it's probably a slightly different number. But nonetheless, there are hundreds of billions of dollars available to be cut that have nothing to do with the troops in the field. And I think people who don't want to cut military spending try to confuse that. They try to say it's all for the troops. How could you possibly cut military spending during wartime? Secretary Gates has made some wonderful statements. Unfortunately, his budgetary priorities don't reflect the logic of his statements. But for example, he has noted that the United States Navy is larger than the next 13 navies in the world combined, and 11 of those navies are U.S. allies. He also pointed out that by 2025, the United States will have 1,700 fifth-generation fighters, top of the line, the most sophisticated in the world. China will have literally a handful. We have 300,000 troops overseas, many of which, as Larry pointed out, are not involved in the wars. They're stationed permanently in Europe and Asia. So, given all of that, it seems reasonable that we could cut back or stabilize the Navy, that we don't need to rush ahead pell-mell with a new fighter plane program, that if we cut back on troops overseas, you would cut back also on military bases and other supporting services, not to mention you'd have slightly different equipment needs if you have fewer troops. So in the report that we did, the Sustainable Defense Task Force, we looked at a number of items in the procurement budget. For example, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, when there was a successful effort to terminate the F-22 program, which I think, people talked earlier about the military-industrial complex. This is the case where the military-industrial complex lost. They were claiming that they had jobs in 44 states, that you couldn't possibly do this. You were going to lose 95,000 jobs. They had giant ads in the Washington Post that said 3 welders in Mississippi were going to lose their jobs if you got rid of this thing. But Congress voted it down, including people like John McCain, Jim DeMint, who never have voted with Obama on anything else. So in terms of the cuts that we're proposing, I believe that a determined administration could win these battles. As for Congress, I think Heather may talk about that, and that is a tougher nut to crack. But so if you don't build Joint Strike Fighters at the current rate, or even, in the meantime, buy current generation systems to replace the planes that they would, the places that they would fill. The Osprey, which is part helicopter, part airplane, could easily be canceled. The Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, which is supposed to help you do marine landings, which we haven't done in 50 years or more. And then if you cut some of these weapon systems, you could also cut some of the supporting infrastructure. There's also things like the Trident submarine, $6 billion a copy. If you're cutting back your nuclear forces, you don't need as many nuclear submarines. You don't need to be building new ones. So there's many other examples in the report, but I think the basic point is there's a lot of weapon systems in this current budget that aren't related to the wars we're fighting, that don't really seem to relate to threats we face in the future, and that therefore are ripe to be eliminated in any new budget plan. I think ultimately we're going to have to limit missions, and I think the most important limit is what Larry mentioned, not fighting wars of counterinsurgency, not fighting wars of occupation. And that also would have a whole different effect on the trajectory of military spending. And then finally, a little bit about Robert Gates. As I said, his rhetoric has been extraordinarily on target, but his budget priorities are quite different. There's been an impression in some of the press coverage that he's cutting military spending, but actually he's rearranging it. He wants to cut some infrastructure. He stopped the F-22 program, but at the same time he stopped the F-22, he increased the Joint Strike Fighter by a comparable amount. And he wants to take whatever quote-unquote savings he gets from infrastructure, pour it into R&D and new weapons. So basically, instead of the military budget growing like this, which I should have put in a PowerPoint, it'll grow at a more, at a slower rate, perhaps 1% instead of 3 or 5%. So in terms of dealing with deficits or just the priorities within our budget, other things we might spend the money on, the Gates plan really doesn't get the job done. He's really trying to save the Pentagon budget, not cut the Pentagon budget. So I probably haven't even used my 8 minutes. I have no idea. But it'd be nice to have some discussion. I very much want to hear from Heather. And so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Well, there's nothing like waiting your turn and getting told that your job is to explain how we fix Congress. So thank you, Bill, for that introduction. I want to circle us back around actually to the point that Linda started us off with from a slightly different vantage point and ask, what is it that the current military budget we have is buying us from a political standpoint? And how could we use what Jamie referred to in his charge to this panel as a strategic economic policy to change our expectations about what the military budget could and should be buying us? And I want to suggest this is actually much more tied up with economics than most people realize, in that the much of the huge boost in military spending over the last decade that my predecessors on the panel have talked about is actually an effort to stave off economics. That to a very large extent, you've had a bipartisan bet placed that we can use our military and endlessly expanding military spending to avoid having to come to terms with a world that is multipolar, transactional, complex, and above all, driven by globalized economics. And that, again, the idea that with a big enough military that could do enough things, we would be able either not to have to deal with that ugly reality or to deal with it on terms that would be more conducive to America and the political system we all remember having 30, 40, 50 years ago. And for just a fun little piece of evidence on that, I'll direct you to the GOP congressional campaign platform for this cycle, which its short national security section contains a bunch of grumbling about insufficient funding for the troops in the field, which is a great slogan for reasons I'll get to in a minute, and then promises the public certainty in an uncertain world. Now, anyone who thinks you can buy certainty in this uncertain world, I want to go live in the world they live in, but that, really points you to the underpinnings of what is all this defense spending for. It's for either the hope or the appearance that we can actually buy certainty with hardware that we don't seem to be able, or it would be too much work or too complex or too much of a change to our political system to deliver for ourselves through global markets. And second, frankly, is a bet that we can use the military to hold the clock back and retain the virtues of our continental isolation and our post-World War II, both military and economic preeminence. That, if you will, while we may have been caught a little bit by surprise, or some folks may have been caught a little bit by surprise by the emergence of globalization, the military and the military budget and the incredible military superiority that the other speakers have described, and I don't need to go through those statistics again, that in a way buys us equality in some of these other venues, or at the very least it buys us at home the feeling of equality, which is where I get to my third point, which is that our military budget represents a hedge placed at various times by both political parties that defense spending is and will continue to be perceived by the public and the media as shorthand or a symbol for seriousness about public security writ large, which, frankly translates back both into an economic sense as well as a military sense, and that we have never gotten past, in the post-Cold War era, in the post-9/11 era, and in the post-9/11 era, we have never entirely gotten past the idea that more money equals more security. And I think if you watch the polls over the last year or two, this is really fascinating, because you saw really heading in 07 and 08, you saw some real public movement on this, and some real sort of willingness to consider that there were other modes of expressing national strength. And at the moment, you're seeing, less, I would argue, on the part of the public and more on the part of the folks who are framing and delivering our news for us, as we don't have another good explanatory framework for all the strange and unpleasant things that have befallen us as a society in the last 4 or 5 years. And as you don't have a very good explanation for some of what hasn't gone so well in the last 18 months, you see a creeping back to this idea that there's an inherent weakness on national security in more progressive and negotiation-based views of the world. So that's out there. I think many of us on the progressive end of things, frankly, thought that that was a demon that we had defeated in the 06 and 08 election cycles. And the bad news is, like the character in Halloween, it's back. And I think it's important, and this is where we get into the congressional hot potato that Bill tossed me, to recognize how the Pentagon and Congress have bound themselves together in a codependent relationship. And I hate to use jargon like that, but I don't really know any other way of framing it, where the pay and benefits one is just an excellent example, because you not only have the problem that Larry described, that the Pentagon's own task forces have identified the problem and are unwilling to do anything about it. But then on top of that, the Pentagon sends its annual budget to Congress with whatever pay rate increase, and then Congress increases it and goes back and says, well, Secretary Gates, you didn't ask for enough, so we're going to give everybody a 3.6% base rate pay raise instead of a 2.8% base rate pay raise. And, the Pentagon knows that Congress will do that and can take advantage of it. And there's zero accountability, zero cost for anyone anywhere to do this. Members of Congress can then turn around and say, see, we're taking care of the troops. My opponent over there, whoever he or she happens to be, is not taking care of the troops. Whoever suggested, God forbid, that the base rate increase proposed was too high, you can imagine what would befall them. As Larry pointed out, our task force actually did include some suggestions about slowing the rate of increase or changing the way that pay and benefits are calculated. And I must say that's the most bipartisan reaction to the report that there's been, the running away from that. But that is based on a sound political calculation. So having laid all that out as a set of bad news, there is actually some good news on the political front. And I would say there's 3 critiques that are relevant, and it's worth, all of them, but it's worth actually teasing them out, because a strategy for moving this forward needs to address all of them. And one is the what I'll call the Civ Mill balance critique, and Larry and Miriam Pemberton with their unified security budget are among the primary exponents of this on the budgeting side, which is simply that we have one very expensive hammer in the Pentagon, and we've made the whole world into a nail. That we've chronically under-resourced state, USAID, Treasury, all of our implements of national power that don't involve guns. And that then becomes an argument for shifting resources, and in some cases a net cost-saving argument, although anyone who claims that you're going to save a lot of money and get things done more efficiently by switching them from Pentagon to the State Department, one should be careful about those claims, but that's a critique that's out there. Second is a more technocratic critique, and here actually you do start to find some more sort of ideological variance on this, just saying the Pentagon is spending money on the wrong things, the Pentagon is spending money on expensive toys it doesn't need, and the Pentagon is spending a lot of money on a counterinsurgency strategy that, as Larry said, if you're not going to do counterinsurgency again, why do you need this much increased end state size for the Army and the Marines? Why do you need some of the expeditionary capacity that you have? Similarly, there continues to be the debate over the romance of high tech. This is where the administration has actually scored a couple of modest but significant wins in ending programs that bipartisan forces of reason had been trying to end in some cases for a decade or more. So there's that technocratic critique, which I think at this point has more traction than it has ever had. And then third, there's the broader economic critique, which says that the fundamental source of our military strength is our economic strength, and ultimately you can't have a strong military sitting on top of a bankrupt country. And this is maybe the most interesting because you've got a number of real rank and file Republicans, people like Kori Schake, who was one of John McCain's national security advisors in 2008 and worked in the George W. Bush first term Pentagon, going out and talking about this kind of thing. And a number of people who want to affiliate themselves with the Tea Party also taking up this critique. Pat Buchanan being a big one, who has a piece out this morning, interestingly enough, calling for defense budget cuts. I'm always a little uncomfortable when I find myself agreeing with Pat Buchanan, but this is worth noting. So you have these three strands, and between those three strands of critique, as I say, you cover your full ideological bases, which is really good news, and the first time in a very long time that this has happened. But there are a sort of concomitant set of bad news, which you're seeing a lot of right now as we draw closer to the midterms. And I think a really key question going forward is how much of the creeping away from willingness to talk about the defense budget that we've seen in the last few weeks we're going to be able to roll back after the midterms, and how much we've frankly sort of the window of opportunity closed sometime in August, and we didn't really notice it closing. The first point here, I think, is the Mullen-Gates point, which others have referred to, that there was a while that we really thought that Mullen and Gates were actually good, that Mullen, the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, going around the country saying the budget deficit is the biggest threat to our national security. I think many of us assumed that meant that there'd be some support for cuts in the defense budget, but Mullen made it very clear this week that that's not the case. He and Gates have both said explicitly that the current efficiency initiatives are designed to enable the Pentagon to maintain its overall top line. And frankly, whoever comes after Gates at the Pentagon, a change that we expect to happen in the next 12 months, is going to have an even harder time pushing through any kind of cost cutting, which it's worth noting, even though we don't see that as significant, it's freaked out Pentagon internally. And then last, the fun part is really going to be the fratricide within the GOP, which Rich Viguerie, of all people, said this morning, we're going to maintain our unity through November 2nd, and then a titanic struggle is going to break out for the future of the GOP. So this and Michael's hovering presence over here lead me to wrap up with a couple of recommendations that we can discuss. And the first is really that there's going to have to be some pretty hardcore politics played around this issue. There's going to have to be some real willingness to do some confrontation. It's going to be a lot of fun, as I say, to watch Republicans squirm on this issue. There's also going to be a lot of Democratic squirming on this issue because there is a lot of fear within the party that you can't take on the defense budget and still look like you're serious on national security. So then the other question is, how do we address that? And here, the good news is I think there's a job for the economists, which is that, as I think every speaker up here has emphasized, to the extent we have a debate about strategy at all in this country, we have no language for making the trade-offs between what we do on the economic side of the house and what we do on the defense side of the house. There are very, very few events and very few discussions like this, particularly over on the progressive side of the aisle, where you have people who are fluent in both languages coming together. So I would say we desperately need a new language of cost, a language that talks about economic cost, that talks about opportunity cost, a language that talks about strategic cost. And we don't have anything like that on the strategery side of the aisle, and it seems to me something where our friends on the economic side of the aisle can be very helpful. And I'll just close by saying you may be surprised. I think in some respects the public is actually way ahead of us on this. And Greenberg, Greenberg-Kuhlen-Rosner has been coming up for a year now with these very surprising polling findings that despite everything the president has done to try to rebuild the image of the U.S. abroad, which people like me spend a lot of time either cheering for or calling for more of, the public perceives that we are less respected now than we were 2 years ago. And why does the public perceive that? Because our economy is in the tank. And that the public has grasped that how our economy is doing matters at least as much overseas as how big our defense budget is and which gizmos it has. And the real question is how we can harness how the work that you're doing can come into the public sphere in a narrative way that helps push that sort of simple piece of common sense forward into the debate. And with that, we'll let Michael come back up and lead us through questions.
Thank you. It's our custom to end on time, so we only have time for one question. Yes, right there.
Thank you very much. Thank you, especially to this panel. And I'd like to say that Ms. Bilmes is a heroine of mine, and it's great to hear you speak in person. My name is Jean Athey, and I have to confess that I am perhaps a mole or a spy in this group, as I'm not an economist. I'm retired. I once was an academic, and after that, a public policy analyst, and now I am a full-time volunteer, unpaid community organizer, peace activist. And so my questions and my comments are really from the perspective of somebody who is trying on the ground to do some of the things that you guys want to see. So I'd like to actually refer back to the first panel who had a question, what is it that you guys need, which was one of the things that she said. And I can tell you some of the things that we need. We need some research and analysis on the privatization of the military. We need something on the economic incentives of companies like Lockheed Martin, and some really good descriptions of their business model that we can share with our communities. And what does that mean? We need some analysis of economic conversion. As you guys probably know, weapons are our biggest export. And so how can we change that and at the same time hold our workers and our communities harmless? We need some analysis of what it means to have a voluntary military, what we call in the peace movement, the poverty draft.
Thank you. We need to let our panelists address those questions.
Just one more thing. And I would like to tell you that there is a strong movement in the peace movement to do exactly what you're talking about. We're calling it Fund Our Communities, Bring the War Money Home. And we want you to join us in the streets, particularly tomorrow when there's going to be a huge demonstration on the mall. I hope to see you there.
Thank you very much for your statement. Are there any responses?
If you're looking at it from a cost point of view, your volunteer military is cheaper in peacetime. The problem is that when we went to it, we assumed that in a prolonged war you would activate the selective service system, which is why we make men register when they turn 18. And it's not just a cost thing, an immediate cost, but as Linda pointed out, the long-term cost when you deploy people over and over again to a combat area without sufficient time in between.
Well, that's a lot to cover. I would say I do an email newsletter that covers a lot of these things regularly, and I'll give you my card. And also, I have done a book about Lockheed Martin, which is going to come out in January. They'll deal with their business model. I think in terms of conversion, the issue is, you know, I don't really believe you're going to be able to produce butter in the same factories that have produced the guns. I do think you can find other jobs for the people, create other kinds of businesses, put money into things like green jobs versus building weapons. So I think it's to some degree it has to do with the broader economy than just, you know, conversion per se of particular factories, and that depends on economic growth, which has been a subject of this entire conference. But it's a tough issue, but I think we'd be setting off on the wrong path if we thought you could take particular factories and flip them into civilian uses.
I think that the item that Heather mentioned about the general belief that more money equals more security, which is this kind of, deep down endemic belief sort of pervading the country, somehow breaking that belief through any kind of means and getting people to disaggregate that equation, that more money doesn't actually equal better security, I think is at the heart of it. And so any grassroots organizations that can help people to understand that, I think is the most important thing. Now, one of the problems that I see certainly in teaching students, and I have several hundred students every year at the Kennedy School, and these are students who are already at the Harvard Kennedy School. So they're already educated and interested in these topics, and they read what you ask them to read, is that people don't have a very good sense of the scale or of what money we spend on what. So people don't really have a very good sense of how much money of our whole total tax dollars, goes into military and military-related and national defense-related stuff. And as I mentioned, there's no clear national account produced by the government, which really kind of shows that, and is distributed across many agencies. People also don't have a really good sense of scale in terms of if somebody hears $10 million or $10 billion. For most people, that doesn't sort of click in what an order of magnitude bigger means. And so I think that sort of any effort, and a lot of organizations do this really effectively, to explain how much money, say, $10 billion really is. We spend $10 billion a month in Iraq and Afghanistan. How much is that? Well, that's 4 times what we spend in the national parks in a year. Is what we spend in, so in other words, the amount we spend per month, per week in Iraq and Afghanistan is what we spend in all the national parks in a year. People have a very hard time, sort of, because it's not presented that way, understanding those kind of trade-offs. And the more that we can do that, the more people can begin to think about whether really just spending more money on that stuff is actually creating more security and better quality of life.
Thank you. Any other comments? If not,
Just on the comparative note, there's a group called the National Priorities Project, which does probably some of the best work on if you spend X amount on the military, what would that buy you in terms of schools and other civilian items. So I would recommend them to you if you're interested in that aspect of the problem.
thanks. I'd like to ask Dr. Galbraith to give concluding remarks, but first, please join me in thanking our panelists.
One of the things I like best about Economists for Peace and Security is that as an organization, we have succeeded over many years in bringing together people who are specialists, experienced practitioners in the national security area, independent economists, members of the larger community, to have a serious and even-tempered discussion of these issues. And I think this panel has been a marvelous example of that. It's a little model of how democracy ought to function, in my view. I want to just say a word of great thanks to the chairs of the panel sessions and to the participants for the exceptional effectiveness and clarity of their remarks and for their extraordinary time discipline. If there was a single example of certainty in an uncertain world, it's that EPS symposia run on schedule. Get the job done. So I'm immensely grateful and proud of you for that. I do want to again thank Bernard Schwartz. I want to thank the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, our partners at the New America Foundation. But I also want especially to thank the staff who make these events possible and make them as good as they are, and especially our director, Taya Harvey, and Ellie Warren, who's here for doing really an exceptional job, both keeping EPS going and organizing these events. Taya, board of. So I would also like to thank the audience for coming and thank those who have followed us on the web, and to say EPS is a membership organization and we would welcome your participation. So please go to the website at www.epsusa.org and sign on. Thank you very much, and we're adjourned.